Next, I'd like to introduce Reggie Thackston. Reggie is a Georgia DNR Wildlife Resources Division Private Lands Program Manager and is also the Bob White Quail Project Leader. He serves as chair of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Agricultural Committee, Forestry Working Group, and for 20 years has worked with Farm Bill Conservation Program and practice development at the national, state, and regional levels. He also serves on the Tall Timbers Research Station Board of Trustees as Vice Chair of the Science and Land Management Committee. So thank you, Reggie.
Thank you, Jen. Good morning, everybody. Good to be here. I have the distinction as being the only speaker here today that can talk slower than Lane Green. This is actually supposed to be a 10-minute talk, and it'll take me 30 minutes to get it. So I can't have it. I was just born that way. Glad and proud of it. No, it's great to be here and talk about this issue. And of course, I know I'm biased, but tall timbers is hallowed ground, particularly when it comes to prescribed fire, because tall timbers came from the work really of Herbert Stoddard, who was hired by a group of concerned private landowners in the early 1900s due to the decline in bobwhite quail. Of course, Mr. Stoddard, against great opposition, ended up determining and standing by and pushing hard and promoting that prescribed fire was the reason, in large part, for the quail decline, and it is still today. And he ultimately, through that effort, published a landmark study that's been considered he is considered to be one of the fathers of modern scientific wildlife management, and he ended up dubbing the bobwhite quail as the who knows what, firebird. And so it's because of that bird and his work that I think we're really able to meet here today. And so it is sort of hallowed ground. And being state quail project coordinator, I have to talk about quail. So that's my quail talk for today. Anyway, it's great to be here. And what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to take the great presentation that Lita gave and drill down a bit and talk about some survey work that we did through the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Forestry Working Group that looks delves a little deeper and looks more explicitly at some of the issues that affect prescribed fire delivery in private lands programs, particularly Farm Bill, and the strategies that we can use, and hopefully some that we'll develop here at this workshop to overcome some of those barriers. This survey, as I mentioned, grew out of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Ag Policy Committee, who at the time was coordinated by Bridget Collins, who's here today. Since then, she's changed hats. She's now with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation as the manager of their private land stewardship, working in the Gulf States. And so I'm glad to have her here to help back me up. And she spearheaded this, and it is a survey that went out to state Farm Bill coordinators, which is what I do for Georgia. And we have some others here that also have that role in their state. Cody Cigatall, Louisiana, I know, is here. And so it was the work of that group that brought this survey under Bridget's leadership together, and we're going to talk about that. But before I get in to those results, I want to talk a little bit about the basis for the survey and why that's important. And again, I'm going to key this. There are other private lands programs. Farm Bill is the big one in the picture, and it's largely comprised of USDA programs that are implemented in great part by NRCS, but also by FSA when it comes to CRP. And the key to that is that Farm Bill programs can and do impact wildlife habitat ecosystems at the landscape scale. They can change and have changed and are changing entire landscapes. And they can do it with prescribed fire. They can do it with with other conservation practices as well. It's a very broad program, but of course today we want to talk about potential and the impacts of prescribed fire. Engaging Farm Bill from a conservation perspective is critically important because of the impacts it can have on private land. And to do that, you've got to work at multiple levels, multiple scales, if you will, all the way from the White House to the farmhouse. And if you drop the ball at any one of those levels, you lose the game. And so it's critical for the prescribed fire community to be engaged and unified in engagement at all of those levels if we're going to increase delivery of prescribed fire. And more explicitly, those can be broken out into national, state, regional, and local levels. And I would submit today, when we have this policy breakout session, this presentation is sort of to set the stage for that, and that a good approach would be to look at those different levels relative to communication strategies. Well, what makes Farm Bill such a driver? Guess what? It's money. It's always about the money, right? So as Lee already pointed out, with landowners, cost is a huge factor. The Farm Bill conservation title provides the single largest source of funding for private lands conservation in the nation. And if you look at these other more traditional funding sources, like the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, Wildlife Sport Fisheries Restoration, State Wildlife Grants, Section 6 funds, Farm Bill either singularly or in total dwarfs funding that comes from those more traditional wildlife funding sources. So that's why it's important. And there's some numbers that change based on the way pots of money get robbed here and there. But anyway, from FY14 to 18, $28.2 billion of authorized mandatory funding that can go to FA and TA. Who knows what FA and TA are? Financial assistance and technical assistance. And everybody in this room knows that those are key components of putting fire on working farm and forest lands, particularly for the non-industrial private landowner. And they're important for a reason, and that is that it does take money to burn. And this is an hour-long presentation in itself, so I'm not going to get into the depth of this, but I want to use it just to illustrate the point. We're all interested here in pine Savannah, frequent, maintained with heavy thinning and frequent fire. Starting a couple of years ago, I worked with Dr. Barry Shiver, who's a retired professor from the University of Georgia, a good friend of mine, and he heads up Smarter Forestry, which is his company, but he's a growth and yield specialist, looking at particularly with loblolly pine, and he's working some now with longleaf as well, but looking at returns on investment through different management strategies for timber. So what we did, I worked with him to come up with some different pine savanna management scenarios that were targeted at bobwhite quail restoration, and looking at comparing those direct costs and the trade-off cost back against a pure optimum economic baseline where timber management was occurring without any bobwhite or pine savanna considerations. And we ran many different, in fact, as it turned out, there were over 350 different model runs of different scenarios. This is just one of them. But what this one looked at was what are the trade-off costs and the direct costs associated with managing for pine savanna on an optimal economic rotation. And for a loblolly pine, that's about 35 years. For longleaf, it's about 42. And we saw that those trade-offs ranged from about 11% to 17% hit to your net present value. That is the discounted return on your investment back to today's value. So it's pretty substantial. And that, money drives the ship. And for a lot of landowners, that's important for them to consider. And particularly the cost of burning was high. And as Kevin mentioned this morning in his introduction, that Many landowners today aren't able to burn themselves, and so they have to hire it done. And we used a cost of, which we came up with an average in Georgia from private contract burners. It was $25 an acre, and that's what we used in this modeling. And when you looked at that, the hit on net present value ranged from $99 to $196 per acre over the life of that stand. So that's a pretty good hit on your net present value for prescribed fire. And that I use that to highlight the importance of any programs that bring money to the table for the landowner. Some landowners do need money to burn. And
hey, Reggie,
yeah.
Question. Did your P&V mostly was that mostly determined by the timber value or merchantable product coming off, or was that did that include any kind of recreational hunting leases, etc.?
We strictly went with timber value. There's a lot of ecosystem service values and other values that, and some of that is not well quantified, as you know, and so we didn't try to include that.
Okay.
Yep, good question. And in that case, we did it with the other scenarios. We didn't include pine straw.
Right.
We don't want to get into that. But anyway, it looks really bad when you throw that one in the mix. And we've known for some time, landowners, that we can get a lot more conservation on the ground if there's funding to drive it. For example, one of the programs that I coordinate, our bobwhite quail initiative, which for 10 years we paid landowner incentives for different habitat practices for quail, including prescribed fire. At one point, we did a survey in 2004 with 102 landowners, and that were enrolled in the program, and asked them, what practices, how many of these practices would you have implemented without the incentives? 76% said they wouldn't have implemented anything without the incentives. So if you're talking about affecting ecosystem restoration at a landscape scale, you need those people doing the work because they form the bulk of the land ownership. This survey that Lita's already referred to looked at 75 landowners in the longleaf range. 80% used burning, with wildlife as an objective for 70%. 39% reported cost, as she's already showed, as a primary limiting factor. And it was interesting that over 80% of those received financial assistance, for which NRCS, and that means Farm Bill, was a primary funding source. And I don't want to get hung up just on FA, financial incentives, because TA is also a critical part of this mix. Landowners will tell you that. Get professional technical guidance out there to help them develop the conservation plan to include prescribed fire. And the funding that comes out of Farm Bill, as I showed earlier, provides that support for both FA and the TA. And then there's all the partners, many of which are in this room today, that also can work through or with Farm Bill, with NRCS, FSA, USDA, to help provide that technical guidance in a partnership fashion. And we can see some of the results of this funding. We look at the 14 southeastern states, 2013, 2014, just under NRCS contracts, 3,855, 600,000 acres and $10.2 million obligated for burning across those 14 southeastern states during that time frame. But of course the question is, and this is really what led in part to our survey work, is this enough to meet the ecological needs? And if not, what are the barriers and how can we work collaboratively to do more? And that ties, of course, to today's or this summit's objectives in terms of how do we affect policy to increase funding to get more fire on the ground. So we implemented this survey. It was in January of 2015. The target audience was, and this was a national survey that went out to 50 states. We had 33 states respond, but for the purposes of today's presentation, we teased out 9 southeastern states agencies' responses, 7 of those in the longleaf range. But the purpose was just to better understand the current use and conservation need for prescribed fire delivered through private lands assistance programs, particularly Farm Bill, identify the barriers and develop strategies to enhance collaboration for fire delivery through private lands programs. And this is a work in progress. In fact, we'll be meeting in September out in Tucson, the APLA annual meeting, and we'll be bringing this back to the table to work on these strategies. So today's work, or this week's work, is going to feed into this very nicely. So one of the questions right off the bat was how necessary is prescribed fire to achieve your conservation goals in your state? And I'll reiterate, these are state wildlife agency Farm Bill coordinators, so you're getting that state agency perspective, and that's often tied to their state wildlife action plans, which guide in great part the conservation efforts of state wildlife agencies these days. And I'm not familiar with all the southeast state plans, but the ones I am familiar with, prescribed fire is right near or at the top of the list, which is a very good thing to see. But all of them said they were essential. Now, we promised with the survey to maintain anonymity in the responses and hoping to get a little more honest feedback, perhaps, maybe a little more blunt feedback. And so I don't have states listed here individually, they're just numbered. But 5 of those said they were increasing, 3 about that burning was increasing on private lands, 3 were about the same, 1 decreasing. Sort of similar to what Lita saw with her results. Next question then was what percentage of the needed acreage is actually getting burned on an annual basis. And you know, what we saw is what you would expect, and that is way less than 50%. In fact, only one state was achieving more than a third, and I don't have the mean, but I suspect it's close to 15%, which is what I think you showed Lita. So we, while we're seeing a glass half full with increasing prescribed fire, we're still far short of where we want to be. So what's getting in the way? And again, this is going back to policy. This is being directed at policy that affects funding and capacity, and we'll get into this a little bit ago. But there are some barriers to the Farm Bill delivery that are outside the Farm Bill itself. And there's a great variety of those. It can be, you know, permits, waivers, or other documents that are required by states, counties, that are independent of the Farm Bill, but they become barriers to Farm Bill delivery for fire. And these are highly varied. Across the Southeast, there's a lot of variation in these. Even within the same state, there can be variability. And we asked the question, are prescribed burns conducted on private lands within designated air quality non-attainment areas? Yes, 4, no, 1, 4, don't know. Part of the results of this, besides giving us perspective on USDA barriers, perhaps, and is also introspective on state agency knowledge or lack thereof about some of the issues that are restricting prescribed fire. But I think this points to the need that state level training or education for both policymakers and implementers is needed about prescribed fire, its use, and these barriers to see if we can reduce or remove some of these barriers that are existing, oftentimes, I think, out of knee-jerk reactions within policy. Then we delved into USDA policy itself within the Farm Bill, and this was not designed in any way to try to hammer over the head USDA or NRCS or FSA, but it was really looking at how can we be a better partner in working with them to refine the policy to make it more effective at accomplishing the goals we want, which are often the same goals and objectives they have from a conservation standpoint. What we saw was there's there's quite a bit of variability in response here as well. Does NRCS require a prescribed burn plan in your state? 7 yes, 2 no, 0 don't know. If you move down that list, you'll see those numbers shift. If it does require, if they do require a plan, does it need to be presented to NRCS before the burn? 5 yes, 2 no. Does it need to be presented to NRCS at the time of cost share reimbursement? 3 yes, 1 no. It's interesting, 5 didn't know. It's hard to inform a landowner if you don't know. And so this is all important, I think, to a need for some training. But looked at it relative to FSA, Farm Service Agency, which has oversight over CRP. You can see again that variability across the board. So what we need, I think, are communication strategies here that cross-pollinate state agencies, NGOs, TSPs with USDA, so that we all have a better understanding of what each other's trying to do and what the barriers truly are, and then we can remove, I think, a lot of these barriers with training and in some cases changing policy. The next set of questions were directed mainly at NRCS, and the first one is, are NRCS employees with appropriate job approval authority, that's a level of training that's required for an NRCS staffer to write conservation or write prescribed fire into conservation plans, write burn plans, assist in prescribed burning, all of which are addressed in this set of questions. So, and I point out that I think the most important one of those 4 categories that are listed there is the actual writing of prescribed fire into the conservation plan. That is critical if we're going to get burning on the ground through the Farm Bill. And it's also poses far less of a risk, so to speak, to NRCS as opposed to, say, them trying to assist with a landowner with actual burn or writing an actual burn plan. So one of the things that teased out of this is that many of the states noted that these activities are allowed only in theory, and in practice that few trainings are available to their staff. And so there's a very much a lack in many cases of sufficient staff within NRCS that have the job approval authority that they need to even write prescribed fire into a conservation plan. And if that can't be done, then basically the landowner doesn't have access to the funding that they need to put fire on their land, to get financial assistance to put fire on their land. So again, points to a communication strategy to affect policy within USDA, and also a need for additional availability of training to get the job approval authority in place. We had a lot of barriers that rose to the top, and these are very consistent with what Lita showed, and I'm not going to go through each one of these, but what I've done is pulled out some that I think that we can address with communication strategies, and they're really in overlapping categories of policy, funding, and capacity. We've heard all of these talked about already today, but these overlap and interrelate. But so in great part, you can see that policy can determine the availability and the focus of funding, both which ultimately then impact capacity to deliver prescribed fire to the ground on working farms and forest lands. Look at these a little bit individually. If we look at the first one there, the lack of landowner interest, that was one that was identified. And that could mean one of many things. Lack of awareness for the need of burning, lack of the availability of cost share assistance or to help fund the burning. It can mean some disinterest or even opposition to prescribed fire. So again, it speaks to the need to drill down deeper into this landowner mindset as it relates to prescribed fire. The second one was liability issues, which we see in every survey, rank out at or near the top. And that concerns the impact, that impacts not only landowners, but also the policies within USDA. Liability concerns can impact policy development that restricts what you can do in terms of recommending prescribed fire. And then, of course, the one we keyed on already, the lack of funding. And there's kind of, again, multiple components of that. Just lack of funding is an obvious one, but it could mean lack of the prioritization of funding. So you can have the funding, but it's not getting prioritized to prescribe fire to the extent that it should be to achieve conservation goals and objectives. And it could also be a lack of prioritization of that funding into spatially explicit landscapes that need to be targeted for restoration. I think that's a critical point. And today we're seeing conservation, whether it's for longleaf or whether it's for bobwhites or any number of other species or ecosystems, that's being more and more landscape driven. And I think that's a really good movement that's occurring within the conservation community. Shotgunning out just doesn't work. We have to target it into these landscapes. And with fire, we've already talked about it, targeting fire frequency into landscapes is critically important. So, and then insufficient capacity to prepare prescribed burns. That can be lack of staff or just lack of job approval authority for existing staff or lack of TSP availability or lack of the partnerships that are needed. So strategies are needed to address these barriers. And these can be, again, I want to reiterate, I think we need to look at them at different levels. Looking at national and regional levels, all of us, NGOs, state and federal agencies, can work through existing committees that are dealing with prescribed fire as it relates to achieving landscape scale conservation goals. These are three that I work on and are very familiar with. Many of you are as well. The AFWA Ag Committee already mentioned, the Southeast Association Forest Land Resources Technical Committee, the National Bobwhite Technical Committee, which is now part of 3 state wildlife agency associations, the Southeast, the Northeast, and the Midwest. And then all the partnerships that we have that can also participate in these committees, but we could also work just as a prescribed fire community, cohesive prescribed fire community to really address the policy issues at the national and regional level through Congress and through USDA leadership. And I think for this, a coordinated communication strategy is really what we need. And I know, am I way fast? You're right at it. Right at it. All right. Doing all right. I'm making my 15 minutes talk. What we need are increased efforts that address capacity to write burn plans. And again, this can be in the form of training, availability, training, emphasis within NRCS. Another issue that arose in this survey is in some states you can't burn in the primary nesting season, and on CRP land in particular. And that's basically the growing season. And we all know for restoration, in many cases, we need growing season burns. In states where you can, where they've worked around it, it still requires jumping through some administrative hoops, often on a track-by-track basis, which can be very cumbersome and just become something that becomes a barrier that a landowner is not willing to deal with. We need to increase cost share and dedicated sign-up opportunities just for prescribed fire. Right now, I'm not aware of any where it's just for prescribed fire within the Farm Bill program. It'd be good if we could get funding and commitment to add more NRCS fire specialist positions to put emphasis on fire and Farm Bill. And then something we're all involved with already, but you can never have too much of, is increased emphasis on landowner outreach workshops. And this is already, and I'm really happy to see that this has been touched on heavily this morning, and that is the increased emphasis on prescribed fire at the appropriate frequency, and I'll add within the appropriate landscapes to accomplish restoration goals. I think we've passed the point where we need to measure success by total acres burned. We've got to look at not just total acres burned, but how many acres were burned at the right frequency within the right landscapes. So with that, I will close it and appreciate your attention. And if there's time for questions, we'll take them.
Before we take them out here, let's see if we have any questions from the call. No? Okay. Yes, sir.
Reggie, would you explain to me from my medial brain, from a private landowner standpoint, why would we need increased capacity for NRCS to write burn plan?
Because they can be limited in terms of how many landowners they can develop plans for by the staff that have or don't have job approval authority. That can become a bottleneck in getting prescribed fire written into conservation plans that are required for you to be able to participate in the Farm Bill.
I understand about putting prescribed fire in the conservation plan, but why would a landowner want someone else like NRCS to write a specific burn plan for a specific time?
Right, and that, while that would be value added, that is not the primary bottleneck. You're correct in that, but it could help if they could do that in terms of just getting the burn plan done.
There's not enough people in NRCS to do that.
Right, like that.
Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say, I think it's great, but I don't know that NRCS is going to do this until we can get the burning done that they already have written out there. Because with like North Carolina, they were getting upset, and other states are getting upset because they have given cost share, and the burning hasn't been able to be done in a timely manner. And so I agree with what you're saying, but I don't know if they're going to jump on wholeheartedly until we do the burning that's necessary first, unless that's changed in the last year or so.
Yes, the question is, do we need to worry about increased writing of prescribed fire into conservation plans if we don't have enough prescribed burners to get the burning done that's already being written in the plans? And I would say it's sort of a chicken and the egg thing, but that's variable across the Southeast in terms of what kind of capacity is there. We could all use more, but that's not the case everywhere. In some cases, the capacity is there, but we're not, it's not getting done. Yeah.
Let's make this the last question.
Okay, this is probably similar, but yeah, I wrote down here the 5 barriers. For number 1 was liability and legal. Right? Number 2 was lack of trained personnel. Number 3 was lack of funding. 4 was lack of landowner interest. And then only number 5 was the inability to write the burn plan on the part of the Fed folks. So it seems like the top 2, the liability, legal, and lack of trained personnel to put the burn on the ground are your major limitations. Did I miss something there?
Well, the trained personnel actually refers not only to putting it on the ground, that refers to writing it in the plan. It accomplishes more than just the actual application of the fire. It really looks at the training. And the training issues related sometimes to funding in terms of being able to afford to send people to training that is available. And if we had more of those training workshops, for example, or a road show through the states, we might end up with more job improvement authority staff within the office. So I don't know, does that answer the question?
Very last question in the back.
Okay, a quick comment. In terms of trying to identify the sequence of these bottlenecks where they occur, the latest figures I saw, and these were only for long range time landowners, was that fire is number one funded practice by NRCS, but the demand of long range time landowners for NRCS systems directly exceeded supply of the dollars. So, you have to, so if I'm correct, in we're already exceeding landowners are demanding more cost share, fine for cost share that can be funded, fires, then, that's the first bottleneck, and then you don't even get to the subsequent bottleneck of we need to build like a plant, have more scrap burners. So again, NRCS is doing an awful lot in install, but ultimately that could be policy.
Yeah, and Lark, related to that, for example, and we all know this, it takes a lot more dollars per acre to plant longleaf than it does to burn it. We've got a long longleaf that's not being burned. And could we shift some dollars through policy, perhaps, out of planting into burning, particularly when it's in the right landscapes? I mean, those are the kinds of things to consider. And it's great to see that NRCS this last year placed increased emphasis on prescribed fire. I'm not trying to beat them over the head. I'm just saying that, but if you don't get additional funding, then you got to look at the prioritization of your existing funding to accomplish what you're after. Just one other point. This one's CRP, but for example, I don't know how many of you know, but with re-enrolled pine stands, CRP, which can include longleaf, starting to include longleaf, only one mid-contract management practice is required in 10 years. That can be a burn or a thin. So you're going to get one burn at best in a 10-year window. Policy change could address that.
I'm going to have to call it at this point. We've got an hour later on this afternoon. If you still got a question for Reggie, write it down. During that hour, we'll be able to catch up on several of these as we go forward. Thank you, sir.
Or ask Bridget.
Thank you, everybody.